Hello and welcome back to Drilled. I'm Amy Westervelt. We have a new season coming for you starting June 3rd. But in the meantime, I wanted to bring you this interview that reporter Adam Lowenstein did with journalist and author Malcolm Harris. You may have come across Harris's work in New York Magazine or his book, Palo Alto. I particularly enjoyed his take on the abundance bros recently in The Baffler. Harris has a new book out now called What's Left that tackles how we can save both democracy and the planet. It's a great read, and this conversation is a great listen. Enjoy. Hey, Drilled listeners, Amy here to recommend another climate podcast. If you have ever wondered exactly where your water comes from, what it means to actually break up with fossil fuels, or what the year 2100 could even look like, check out the Climate Dispatch from the folks at the Sierra Club Angeles chapter in collaboration with Stranded Astronaut Productions. The show is brand new. It launched in April, just in time for Earth Day, and it answers all those questions and more. The Climate Dispatch explores both global and local stories of the climate crisis through the lens of Southern California. On the show, host Taya Jeanette brings together a variety of guests and experts in conversation to share their climate wins and break down their fears and collective hopes for the future. Some featured guests include Time 100 Next recipient and climate activist Naleli Kobo, Troy Stevens, creative manager of Grist Magazine's Imagine 2200 Climate Fiction Contest, Aru Shaini Ajay, executive director of the Sunrise Movement, and Allison Chin, president of the Sierra Club Board of Directors. Each episode will also feature a local LA-based band or musician to play out the show. Check out the Climate Dispatch at sc.org/climate dispatch or wherever you listen to podcasts.
Building a portfolio with Fidelity Basket Portfolios is kind of like making a sandwich. It's as simple as picking your stocks and ETFs, sort of like your meats and other toppings, and managing it as one big, juicy investment. Now that's pretty good. Learn more at fidelity.com/baskets. Investing involves risk, including risk of loss. Fidelity Brokerage Services, LLC. Member NYSE SIPC.
Thanks for being here, Malcolm.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
So I wanted to ask you to start. I have my own theory of this, but I'm curious what you see as the purpose of your book.
Oh, I want to hear your theory. And I should hear it before I hear my theory, because then you're going to copy me. When I set out to write this book, at first I thought I'm going to write about why I'm right and everyone else is wrong. Everyone who even sort of agrees with me is wrong. And they all need to completely agree with me. And I have the only explanation for how we get through the climate crisis. And when people read my brilliant explanation, they'll have no choice but to agree with me in my understanding. And then I thought about that for a second and thought well, that's not true. That won't happen. Even if I make a spectacular argument, I could convince, some people, but most people are probably doing what they're doing. Even people on the left, as I'm broadly considering it, who don't agree with me on specifics, are doing what they're doing for a number of reasons, not just because they're particularly convinced, but because they have a temperamental affinity with what they're doing. They have interpersonal commitments. People, we live in a society, and I wasn't going to remake that society by making an argument. And so I decided the most useful thing I could do was operating from some base of shared understanding, give a sort of showcase of what I think are the relevant ideological paths that the left has open to it right now. And this is mostly, I wrote this during the Biden administration. And so we had some left-wing people within some proximity to power for some period of time who were working on economic policy. And so from that, the left wing of the Biden economic team all the way to insurgent communists. I think there was a certain level of agreement about some important terms such that we could have a conversation about what everyone believes and then how we fit together. And so this book was my attempt to sort of give the strongest presentation I could of these different paths, even if I don't agree with everything in there, both strengths and weaknesses, and then think about the whole field in a way that's holistic and realistic. But you as a reader, what was your take? That's more interesting to me.
I will say on the, having written it during the Biden era, but of course readers are consuming it in the second Trump era, the mentions of Lena Khan made me somewhat wistful and nostalgic for a time that feels very far away, even though it was not that long ago. So what it felt like to me was that it was essentially a bracing bucket of cold water, which itself will be kind of a valuable commodity in the not too distant future. Like there's no benefit to pretending that the problem is not as bad as it is, and that the crisis is not as acute and real and world spanning as it is. We'll get into this a little bit later, I'm sure, but there is a sense of inertia, the way that capitalism works, that all of us, including those of us on the left, can get very comfortable with that. What it felt like to me was you repeatedly reminding people that it's as bad as you think, probably worse. And there is, we don't do ourselves any favors by avoiding the discomfort of that reality.
Yeah, that's just true, right? Right. So if we're talking about like foundation, I'm against deluding ourselves. I'm interested to see how much people will focus on different, like, think about it as an optimistic or pessimistic book or whatever, or a hopeful or hopeless. And I try not to work within those boundaries usually. I feel like they don't guide us in the right directions, because try to be a very dialectical thinker, right? So there's hope even in the most hopeless moments. And then there's despair even in our best strategies. But yeah, I don't think there is any point. I think that's a premise for the project, is that there's no point in deluding ourselves, and that I'm not going to lie to my readers about what I understand the situation to be. And the situation it's pretty dire. But we can also, people have been in dire situations for a long time. We're not the first people to see the end of the world. And we can learn from other experiences with that. So for me, it's a forward-looking book, not a backward-looking book or a, skyward, despairing-looking book. It's a forward-looking book. I'm thinking about where we are, where you go, and to go anywhere, you have to start from where you are. You can't imagine you're somewhere else. It's not a path for movement.
Yeah, you say early on that the message to me, at least, was it's worse than you think. But you also write pretty early in the book that I'll assume from the beginning that success is possible, which is
right. It's
both very pessimistic and very optimistic at the same time, which I guess maybe is just a way of describing realism in some ways.
Well, I think that I cite the late and great Mike Davis, who says, well, we have to be realistic even about our realism, that you can look at the situation ecologically and turn to stone, is what he says. It's very bad. And you can look at the situation and see how bad it is and freeze. There's a real temptation to do that. And there's a temptation to ignore it, right? To just not look.
Right.
But I think realistic about our realism is to find a middle in between those and say, like, the situation's bad and we can still move. We are not stone, right? We have the ability to think and we have the ability to act, and we can do both collectively.
So in understanding the status quo, the stakes of the present moment, or the state of the present moment, I guess, you talk about the oil value life chain. Can you explain what that is as kind of a fundamental premise for where we are right now? Yeah,
actually, the concept for this book is really this oil is life syllogism, which I awoke from a dream with. I was like going to pitch a whole different book. And the night before the conversation with my agent, I woke up from a dream with this phrase, the oil is life.
Fossil fuels they're in your brain.
Well, they are in so many ways. Microplastics alone.
Yeah, that's a good point. Literally.
In another way, literally, like oil is life. So we know the phrase, the water is life from the Dakota Access struggle. And that's true, right? Everyone knows that. You literally can't live without water. Like, we know that. And that should be decisive, right? That should, everything should flow from that fundamental truth. If we are operating rationally, one would think. And yet the assertion, the phrase, the truism, the truth that water is life has not shifted our politics. It has not shifted our state behavior. It hasn't affected the path we're on that much, except in this insurgent way. And so the question is why? There has to be something truer than, at least in our society, water is life. And the more you think about it, or the more I thought about it, once this phrase, whatever, wouldn't leave me alone, it's true that oil is people's lives. People's lives are tied up very, very, very literally in the fossil fuel system, and not just the gas that they put in their car, although certainly the gas that they put in the car, or the, polyester clothes that they use to put on their children, but also the dividends from the Exxon check that is going into their pension fund. The people's lives are really, really tied up in these systems, not just in their need for consumable energy that can be replaced with a solar panel. And until we're realistic about that, unless we acknowledge that, we can't change it. And that's, to me, explains why every group, every agency, every state, every community that has tried to address this imminent crisis, this currently elapsing crisis of climate change, has found itself really totally unable to do it, not at the scale that is necessary. Even when we talk about, and I write in the book, when we think about China, which is, as a state, maybe done the most to address the exigencies of climate change at scale, it's not there. It's not a reasonable reaction to what's happening in the world. We're not able to do that. And it's because oil makes our life, for everyone in the world almost, that we face this block. And you need value as that center term to explain why it's not just oil itself that shapes our lives, but the fact that oil is valuable, and valuable is the structure that explains and organizes the entire social metabolism, means neither of these things are easy to cut off from each other, right? It's not that we just use so much oil in our household production. We don't necessarily, even for it's heating and driving is mostly what people use fossil fuels directly for. I mean, some cooking too. But it's not like you can get an EV and get an induction stove and the whole problem is solved. It is a problem at the level of value. And as long as fossil fuels have value, which they do, because you can use them to accomplish a whole number of things. And as long as value is the term that structures our whole world, we're going to find ourselves unable to control our social situation, unable to control our ecological situation, unable to control what I call our social metabolism.
I think one of the main points that I took from this, or I found clarifying about this, was the idea that our entire society is structured around the idea of value for value's sake, or value production for value production's sake, is an inherent good on its own. That's kind of the basis for this whole system we live in. And as long as that's the case, and oil is valuable, then that chain will be unbroken. Is that a reasonable interpretation?
Yeah, and we can see the implications very simply. And I start with this story of going to the Shell conference where they wanted me to speak, and talking to this engineer/finance guy for Shell who's explaining that, well, when we stop using a well because of climate pressure or whatever, we sell it to somebody else and they're going to use it. And
right.
So the oil in that well is still going to get used, even though we're complying with our climate commitments or whatever. We'll just sell it to some gangster, literally just some gangster who can operate it at a lower cost because they're evading the safety responsibilities that have been foisted upon Shell. They're avoiding the labor responsibilities that have been foisted upon Shell because that oil is valuable. You could still use that. And it's well, if you replace, 200 million gas-powered internal combustion engine personal vehicles in the United States with electric vehicles, those cars don't just disappear. They're going to be sold somewhere where they don't have as many cars, because suddenly you can get a car for way cheaper. Mm-hmm. And then those cars are still going to need to be powered with gasoline that's still going to power the car that someone will find money in being able to supply. That person who's able to sell the gasoline for that car is going to be able to live, right? They're going to be able to reproduce their lives. Maybe they're going to be able to improve their lives and the lives of the people around them and their loved ones. And I'm not going to be able to convince them not to do that. You're not going to be able to convince them not to do that. State regulations aren't going to be able to convince them not to do that. I compared it to the war on drugs. There's theoretically a war between every government in the world and like drug dealers. And drug dealers are winning that war and have been winning that war for decades. And it's not because they have bigger armies or whatever. It's because drugs are valuable, and value is the way that we find our way to life.
So you organize this book around 3 collective strategies, as you call them. And I actually don't want to spend a ton of time on each one of them because that's what the book is for. And there's so much nuance in each of these that people should just go read the book for that. But just as a little bit of scene setting, can you just give a bit of an overview of what the 3 different strategies are that you outline in the book?
Yeah, I describe them as, and I use the strategies as the names and the organizing principle rather than like ideology thing. So it's not socialism in the middle term. It's public power. I describe it as public power because I want to keep focused on the strategies themselves rather than these kind of political identifications or identities. So the strategies as I describe them are market craft, which is using the state to intervene to break the connection between fossil fuels, oil, and value by building a clean energy economy and by regulating fossil fuels out of existence. And so I call that market craft. It's a term designed by the political scientist Stephen Vogel that I really like. But it's a pretty broad spectrum of policies even within this chapter. The second one is called public power, which people might understand as like democratic socialism or just socialism, which is where the state is actually doing the green transition itself. It's loosening both the connections between value and life and between fossil fuels and value by building a clean energy economy and providing a basic quality of life for all people independent of their relation to the value system, such that fossil fuel can't make the same demand on us that they make now for us to ruin our lives and ruin the collective life. And that's organized through organized labor developing itself in the interests of the entire society and taking control in that collective interest.
And we saw some of those first and second, the market craft and public power strategies during the Biden years.
Yeah, you could point to examples for sure. More market craft than public power, I think. But you can definitely point to examples. And then the third one is what I call communism, which is breaking that connection between value and life and organizing life itself around different principles, specifically to each according to their needs, from each according to their abilities, rather than according to their ability to produce value.
And you talk in the book about choosing the word or settling on the word communism rather than something more complicated that might not have the same political baggage, I guess.
Yeah, I'm not scared of the word communism, and maybe I should be these days, and maybe I would be now more if I read it again now. But for me, I think having an honest relationship with my readers is really important. That I'm never going to try and dumb things down. I'm never going to try and handle my reader strategically in that way with regard to the truth or what I think. I'm not going to give the reader anything less than what I think. And that's a pretty firm commitment from me as a writer, which it becomes difficult in these kind of situations where I'm taking something that's pretty, I don't want to say theoretically dense, but definitely fraught. That's very important for my thought. And then I have to find a way to share it with a broad audience. And the best way I've found to do that is pretty straight up. And sometimes I need a note to explain to the reader, like, look, this is what I'm doing. I trust you to trust me to get us where we're going, and not need to call it like communism or like communalism or whatever, something else.
Right.
It's, if I'm talking about to each according to their needs, from each according to their abilities, I'm talking about communism. Like, I'm a Marxist. I'm not afraid of that. I think society should be less afraid of that. And it's my duty to make society less afraid of that in some ways. So I trust my readers, maybe to my own detriment or downfall, but I can't help myself.
I feel like it's just a good operating principle for a writer and just for a human being in the world of just to trust people, give them the benefit of the doubt.
I think so. But I find a lot of writers don't feel the same way necessarily. A phenomenon I see a lot is writers trying to write down to their reader from a place that's not very high to start with.
Yeah.
And so people who are assuming they're like, you know, too clever or too informed for their broad readership, and they're taking something that's already not first rate and diluting it down further to the point where like the readership can't really get anything out of it. And there's just not much there. And so I'd rather like look straight across the table at my reader, because that's where I will always think they are, right? I'm always writing for curious, thoughtful readers the best I can.
Unless we get diverted into the, a conversation just about the writing process, which I would love to have, but is probably not what people signed up for. I do have a note written on a sticky note taped to my monitor here that says, respect your reader, trust them to get it, don't hit them over the head with it. And I don't always succeed in that. I probably usually don't, but I at least try to remind myself that people are smart.
I've had a lot of luck. Respecting my reader and respecting readers in general. And I think there are a lot of smart readers out there, way more than people think there are, way more than a lot of writers think there are.
So coming back to the book, there's an interesting theme throughout, which is this idea of class conflict. And there's a lot of points in each of the three strategies and in the book more broadly, where you make the point that whatever you think or have convinced yourself that this fight taking on climate change is about, at its core, any sort of realistic long-term solution involves class conflict. Can you explain a little bit about why that is? Because I feel like especially a lot of us on the left, or maybe more of the like liberal progressive left rather than the capital L left, we've been taught, and we're still very hesitant to say the class word.
Yeah, I think you have to go to the mode of production, because capitalism is a mode of production, and you have to look at what are the conditions and relations of that mode of production. And that's what we do as Marxists, is we look at the capitalist mode of production, which is the mode of production we live under. It's the most mode of production-y mode of production, right? It's the archetype for all other understandings of mode of production. And we look at what are its relations, right? Well, we see a relation between a capitalist class and a working class. There's a class that produces value, and there's a class that receives that value. It's a funny inversion, right? Because the capitalist class creates the work, and the working class creates the capital. That's a little Mario Tronti for our morning. And so that is the basis for this production system, production for production's sake, that organizes our entire global society, and that which we find ourselves unable to control. So it's ultimately a relationship that we're unable to control. It's not the machines themselves, right? We can't fetishize the objects that are produced by the system of production. It's this relationship that we're unable to control. And that's true for emissions, right? That's true just at the very like basic level. It's that it's not like the machines are dragging us into this situation or whatever. It's our social relation, and not our individual social relations, but the social relations at the class level, which is what enables production in the first place. And so without disturbing that, and I don't necessarily claim that you have to abolish it in order to have a path through, right? That's what I think. I'm an anti-capitalist. I think we need to abolish capitalism. But from a market craft perspective, you can change the way that capitalism works. And I think it's worth acknowledging that and trying to understand that perspective as well. But to do that, you still have to understand the class relation as an obstacle to any sort of control over the social metabolism. And so whether you have to like absolutely destroy capitalist production or not is a question that this book leaves open, because I think it's a question that's on the left. But if the premise is that the oil value life chain is wrapped around the gate to positive futures, and we need to find some way to break it or to bend it, to slip through that gate, then we're going to have to change the production mode that we have, at least such that it's unrecognizable. And that is a class conflict. That's a relation between two classes of people, not a relation of objects.
One of the challenging parts of the book I found was the reminder that this is not as simple as if we can provide some sort of organizing force for workers to unite around, then everyone will be naturally drawn to that, and workers of the world will unite and rise up. there are a lot of people and a lot of institutions of organized labor more broadly that have a lot invested in, quite literally jobs, but also the broader economic and political status quo, which I feel like it's already hard enough just to organize all the workers if all we had to do is create a platform for people to gather and rise up. But actually, it's not as simple as that.
Yeah. Well, honestly, I don't think it becomes easier by pretending it is easier. And I think some people run into that problem with some of the more vulgar public power advocates, where if we focus on the easy solution, then it will actually become that easy. But the truth is that there are striations and huge conflicts within the working class. You see that domestically, and you see it internationally. And we have to be really serious about that. We're really serious about our situation. And if we pretend that, all workers in the world have the same sets of interests and American workers are not advantaged by the exploitation of workers in Brazil in any way, shape, or form, because we're all members of the working class. Like that's true from one perspective. There's an important perspective from where that's true, but it's not the whole truth. It's not realistic enough. And so we need to map the conflicts within the working class in order to build the working class as a real force. We can't just pretend that there's no issues with gender within the working class, which doesn't mean that working class people are sexist or whatever. It's about the structure of these abstractions in really impersonal ways. Obviously, there are personal, interpersonal, personal ways as well. But what I'm talking about is the impersonal structures of these things. And so you have situations where you have construction workers lobbying in favor of gas-powered crypto mines is one of the examples I use. And that's terrible. That's bad planning. That's in your own very, very narrow interest. That isn't in the interest of the global working class at all. And so we need to be serious about what the composition of the working class is, and not just treat it as some self-evident abstraction.
How do you think about the fact that for a lot of people, and I include myself in this, I think none of us are immune to it, but many of our beliefs, including for a lot of people, all things climate and environment, they seem to be downstream from our political identity. These days, if you are a Republican, self-identified, and that's part of your identity, you are probably not going to be, to put it mildly, enthusiastic about democratic efforts to tackle climate change. And that seems like a, overcoming kind of entrenched political identities, or maybe loosening them a little bit. And so people can vote Republican while also believing in climate change. And obviously this is a little bit of a kind of a micro example, but of a broader phenomenon of what people believe being downstream from how they see their identity. I just wonder how you think about that dilemma.
Yeah. So I'm not a liberal, so I don't get my marching orders from polling and stuff.
Mm-hmm.
And there's a lot of contradictory polling or election results, which sounds kind of silly because election results obviously play a really important role in structuring the field in which we operate. But I don't think that those votes are the truth or something about society. And if you look at polling for do you think we should focus more on economic growth or the environment? The way we talk about people, you'd think people would say, everyone says growth or whatever. It's not true. Totally not true. Americans are, when they're polled and asked to how important the environment is, say the environment's very important. I think people believe in climate change. I think people walk outside and believe in climate change. Never mind the apocalyptic floods and fires and stuff that are unavoidable. We have a very polarized partisan political environment electorally in the United States. I don't think that has any or very much bearing on the actual truth of our historical situation. And I try not to let it influence how I think about these questions. Because I think then you end up looking 2 inches in front of your face, often at some reflection in some mirror or something. I find it very hard for people who orient themselves that way to get a historical understanding. And I think that's the kind of understanding we need.
I felt like there were a few different concrete messages for progressives, mainstream progressives who are left of the Democratic Party, but might not be, again, capital L, or might not think of themselves as capital L left yet.
I sure hope so. Tell me what they are.
I mean, one of them you say very explicitly at one point is, essentially break up with the Democrats, capital D Democrats, which I have to imagine after the last few weeks, there's a lot more openness to. Maybe after the last couple of years, there's a lot more openness to among folks on the left that the Democratic Party as an institution is not the vehicle for change people might have anticipated it to be, again, to put it very mildly.
Yeah, I think I cited Kim Moody is maybe the book I'm talking about, because that's really his argument, is that we need a United States Labor Party in order to pursue the interests of workers. I think that's an important perspective. I'm not 100% convinced that's true. I think that, as far as I'm concerned, the Democratic Party and even parallel institutions like the New York Times or something are much like the United States state itself, where I think the perspective that this is a force for historical evil in the world and we need to distance ourselves from it and there can be no progress through these things. I think there's a strong argument for that perspective. I think it's an argument worth hearing out and worth thinking through and sometimes conceding to. At the same time, I think that these are internally contradictory structures. I don't think everyone who works for the U.S. government is a butcher of Gaza, right? Even though the U.S. government is itself a butcher of Gaza. And so do those contradictions within these institutions allow us to move in a positive direction? I think it's possible. I'm not saying everyone who thinks that is wrong, certainly. Has that perspective taken a blow in the past 6 months? Yeah, I think probably. But I think these are conversations we need to have and topics we need to think about. But what are the other ones?
I'd say the other one, which is a little bit less direct, but not much so, that emerged to me while reading the book was this idea that, as you put it, breaking the situation into ostensibly manageable chunks is essentially a form of denial.
Mm-hmm.
And that's a pretty bracing argument, I think, because I feel like a lot of us realize that to some extent. If you ask us very concretely, map out how we get from here to saving the planet and its creatures in those little manageable chunks, we admit pretty quickly that it can't be done. And yet it's such a comforting way to see the crisis as something you can just break up into small chunks and tackle sequentially.
Yeah, well, and it's something that is broadly and impersonally distributed, that's distributed by a collective logic that we don't have to operate. That would be really nice, because then we could just do our part. Everyone could just do their part and it would get done and we wouldn't have to figure out what we're actually doing. And that's how capitalism works, right? So that's actually not how solving our problems works. That's how causing our problems works, is everyone just goes out there doing their little part one day to the next, and we don't have to try and get together and actually think of what we're doing and decide what we're doing. Everyone can just worry about their household sized share. That's not going to work. It doesn't work. It's not working. We really do have to make collective decisions, organize to make collective decisions. I don't see any other way through. So yeah, I'm glad that came through, because I think that's the ground for this project, right? If that weren't true, then we wouldn't need this book. But I think it is true, and so I do think this book, we need ways, auspices, common understandings under which we don't have to necessarily come all together and work in one organization. I don't think that's going to happen. I don't think it's very realistic. But we need some kind of what I call coherence to these efforts.
Yeah, I think you put it at one point, that's the only way to actually tackle it at the scale of what the problem is.
Yeah, and what's the point of tackling it at another scale, right?
Right. Besides making us feel better in the moment.
But it doesn't make us feel better because we're not stupid.
We know that that's not going to do it.
Yeah.
I don't think you even say Trump or use the letters in that order in the book, but I have to assume that you wrote it with the possibility of a second Trump term in mind.
Trump gets a couple mentions. He gets 4. I'm looking at the index.
Okay.
But yeah, I mean, I try to write all of my books that way. I try not be dependent on what's happening that week, month, year. And so even with my Palo Alto book, when it came out, people were like, well, why didn't you write about crypto? There's all this crypto stuff happening right now. Why didn't you write a whole chapter about crypto? And it's like, well, that's not what I'm trying to do here. This is
Mm-hmm.
trying to take a historical view on the situation. And so my hope was that this book works no matter who got elected president and no matter who gets elected president the next time around, right? That the truths that I try and unfold in this book are larger than control over the White House.
Do you think that the return of, at least return to the White House and the government of MAGA types changes any of the arguments you make in the book or shifts the priorities for some of the different strategies?
Yeah, absolutely. I think there are paths that seem more or less open depending on what the political system looks like and who's in control. And again, it's like the MAGA rise or the rise of Donald Trump is not an isolated event globally, right? This is part of a global rightward shift in reaction that is absolutely one of the not just possibilities that I lay out in the book, but one of the challenges, one of the sort of inevitable challenges is that there's a reactionary movement, a reactionary pro-fossil fuel movement that you're going to have to confront as part of any of these strategies. And one of the reasons we need coherence between them is that we're all vulnerable. But also, I don't think that necessarily any one strategy is particularly worse off under Trump, because you could look at, market craft and say, well, Donald Trump destroyed the IRA, the Inflation Reduction Act. He's destroyed all Biden's climate work has been destroyed with the wave of a hand, which then salts the earth for this kind of policy in the future because capital won't commit to doing these kinds of investments if they know that there's a coin flip that the next president's going to just dismantle it all in 1 second.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that's pretty devastating for market craft. But public power, if he shuts down the Department of Education, then he's able to shut down whatever public power agency that Biden should have set up instead or whatever. All of that would have been destroyed as well. Not to mention his attack on organized labor. It's not like he couldn't attack those things from the same position.
Mm-hmm.
And communists as well. One of the major dangers of the communist strategy, as I describe it, is susceptibility to government repression. And we've already seen that, right? We've already seen a real qualitative jump in the kind of repression we're getting from the Trump administration focused on the left. And in a way that people should be seriously alarmed about. First they came for the communists kind of way.
Mm-hmm.
And so all three, we're all reeling. Everyone, the entire left is obviously reeling. And anyone who looks at the situation and says ha ha, this is good for me and bad for you, I think is wrong.
There is a series of 2 questions from the Zetkin Collective. Is that right?
Mm-hmm.
Am I saying that right?
Mm-hmm.
That you cite at the end. And they're obviously somewhat rhetorical, but they are: will fossil capital defend itself to the bitter end? And will it draw on the unique resources of the far right to do so? And I feel like those questions are being answered quite clearly in the moment that we're living in.
Yeah, and it's pretty obvious when they put it that way, right? I think that's a really good phrasing of the question or questions, right? Because it's well, of course they're going to fight for their own existence. And well, okay, if they're going to fight in the political sphere, they're going to have to pick an avatar or whatever, even putting aside the whole history of their relationship with the far right. It's well, they're not going to pick the far left. They're probably not going to pick the center at this point. The far right is their best bet, by a long shot, for a number of reasons that are described in that book, which people should definitely check out. So yeah, that has come to pass, right? And it seems obvious when we think about it. And a clear problem with the sort of climate policy by compromise that even I think the left liberals have been pursuing for a little while, with the hope that we'll give capital and capitalists enough so that this transition will be smooth enough for them that they can agree to it, while they also think about all the things that they can lose in a storm or whatever. And that's obviously not happening. That can't be the only solution, right? That can't be the only tool we have. And hopefully one of the virtues of the structure of this book is that then we've got at least a small set of different tools strategically, rather than just one perspective that is blocked.
I was actually surprised to find, just because of the way the book is structured, it didn't seem like it was leading toward A, B, C, D, this is what we need to do, kind of a solutions type of book, and then the world will be solved and everyone will feel better. But there was a very clear very concrete proposal that you offer at the end. You write that the left should lead the formation of community disaster councils. And I feel like the value, lowercase v, value of that suggestion, that proposal feels even clearer given what we've seen over just the last couple of months. Can you just talk a bit about what that means? Because I feel like it's the kind of concrete thing that many people are yearning for right now. And it's again, lowercase v value feels very real right now as something people can do.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it's funny, I've had some conversations about this where people I'm talking to have tried to figure out if there's something that they're not understanding about what I'm saying because it seems so simple. And I'm saying like, no, it really is as simple as I'm saying.
Yeah.
It's that the institutions and individuals with which we compose our communities needs to collectively study and prepare for the social and climate disasters that we know are upon us, right? So within wherever you live, you can figure out what extreme weather events are likely to happen, and you can figure out what responses to those are most likely to keep people safe, and we can organize those. And we need to do that not at the level of like necessarily just government disaster response, which now we're seeing undermined obviously by conservatives. But even if that weren't the case, we need to organize ourselves, not just rely on the state to organize our response to what are social-wide problems. This partly because the state is unable to and unwilling to solve that at the level that we need. And I think the left, as I outline it, is in a particular position to lead this kind of structure that society as a whole is in desperate need of. And that's something that we all can do, and something we all can do collaboratively. Whether you are a staffer for a state senator who believes in market craft, or whether you're a shop steward who believes that labor should be directing the entire thing, or you're someone who knows the forests around where you live very well. Right? Like we need the resources of all of those kinds of people, as well as the institutions and social networks that they represent. And we need ways for them to cohere, to work together, to respond to these things that we already know are happening, right? So disasters are organizing us already, whether they organize us, whether we organize in advance of them in response to them, or we organize in a disorganized way after they have occurred to us. Disasters are organizing us regardless. And so I think community disaster councils and community, as I write and think, can also be like global, right? If you're a climatologist, let's say working the IPCC, that's a community. It's a community of people working together on this project. And I think local communities need to find ways to work with those international communities, global communities of experts to inform our efforts as well. But that's not crazy, right? Like the idea that we should have like civil structures that are responding to these like big things that we know are coming and that will upend all of our lives collectively in a similar way or in at least a shared way. Like, let's get ahead of that. You know, I don't think we can just rely on, there's this line that we can rely on the generosity of other people in terms of crisis. And we should let that sort of like guide us into a new future or whatever. And I've been sympathetic to that line, and I think it's true to a certain degree, but I don't think it's sufficiently responsive to our current situation. I think we need to like think in advance and plan in advance and organize in advance for these problems that are absolutely knowable.
I think there's something remarkably empowering about that type of work too, at a time when a lot of people feel like things are out of control and that we don't have any agency and we're all just doom scrolling and watching democracies collapse and the world burn. Gives you a sense of agency, empowerment, and then as you note in the book, it also can provide kind of a use case for this different world that we're hoping to build. That if the left can lead these, this broader response to these disasters, which as you note are happening already and are inevitable, that they're going to continue happening, we are, potentially proving that another way of organizing a society works. Because you can't just, as we were talking about earlier, you can't just tell people, give up the way you've experienced society, the only world that any of us have ever known, and trust us that this other one will be better. That involves huge sacrifice. from you and your family potentially. Much easier if you have a demonstrable, evidence that you can point to that like this is another way to organize a society and we showed that it works.
Yeah, well, I think people even if it's risky, I think people are willing to take the risk of the unknown when it's offered to them at this moment. I feel like that we don't do enough recruiting on the left in some ways into these conversations and into these efforts. And that can't just be like, oh, we have the right idea or whatever necessarily. It has to be like, how are we going to solve these collective problems? And how are we going to solve these collective problems? How are we going to make sure that the people in our community, if there's a flood or a fire, have access to the life-saving medication that they need next week? Well, where is the medication held? Well, there are 7 pharmacies in our city. There are pharmacists who work at those 7 pharmacies. So we can talk to them. We can talk to those pharmacists. We can organize the pharmacists of our city such that we will have a disaster plan and we'll be ready to enact it. And we're not going to go check with CVS corporate and follow their plan or whatever. And we're not going to wait for the National Guard to give us a plan because somebody needs their heart pills next week. In fact, we know how many people need their heart pills next week. We have a list of them and we know where they live. And we have pharmacists who are ready to fulfill those needs in the event of a disaster. Like, that's not an illusory sense of control, right? That's actual control over your circumstances, right? You're organizing actual community control over your circumstances. Not right now, but in the event of these disasters that we know are going to elapse, that are elapsing. And so I think that's really a place for left-wing leadership, or a place that we can build the cohesion and use it at the same time among this really a pretty diverse swath of people, but people who all share, I think, a common interest and belief and desire for a better world.
I wanted to come back to this idea because I feel like it has been pervading this conversation and certainly the book as well, that recognizing, acknowledging, accepting, even, I guess, embracing in some ways the scale of the problem, the scale of the crisis can feel, to me at least, it feels kind of liberating because you can kind of drop all the artifice of like, we're just going to hack our way out of this crisis or something. And once you let that go and you realize, I should say, once I, in my mind, let that go, I don't want to speak for anybody else, but accept that, yeah, things are potentially going to get really bad. I realized how much work it was taking to create these false, soothing, comforting futures in my mind. And all of a sudden, it kind of frees up all this energy and brain space to think about actually tackling it rather than existing in sort of a comforting world of my own making. So I'm just wondering how you think about that, the idea that it is painful to see it for what it is, but it's also kind of liberating in a way that all of a sudden it frees you up to get after it, I guess, instead of convincing yourself it's not so bad.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's one of the real benefits of the radical imagination. And so that's a lens that I've used to think about the world since I was a kid. That's how I've always thought, not always, but, since I took hold intentionally of the way I thought about the world, that's how I thought about the world. There's some downsides to that in terms of communicating with people who are thinking about the world differently. It can be hard. You can get, as I write in the book, you can get really obsessed with the complicity of everyone who doesn't see it the same way as you. You can get really like isolated and angry. I spent a long time, particularly when I was young, being angry all the time at the whole rest of the world. And so there are perils to thinking that way. But I think there are also real benefits. And that's something that I try to share with my readers is the benefits of that sort of radical imagination. That when you think about the world historically and in its actual shape, it is freeing. Absolutely, it should be freeing. The truth is freeing, right? Trying to tell yourself that what is happening isn't happening and constantly recalibrating, right? It's like the frog in the pot being like, well, this isn't that hot.
Right.
But it's getting hotter. And so you have to constantly tell yourself, this is fine. This is fine. Well, it's much worse than it was 2 weeks ago. Well, they did overturn Roe, but this is fine now. Like this is how it will be fine. That can take up your whole mental space, right? There are people who spend all of their mental effort constantly reassuring themselves that things are still fine. And the fact that things aren't, the fact that things are very bad, it doesn't mean that you give up. it doesn't mean that then you are relieved from having to do stuff, or that you then can just spend your time wallowing in despair, at least not for me. Like I said, I think there's a whole spectrum of middle activity where we say, all right, you look at the world and say things are bad, and then you say, all right, what are we going to do about it?
Mm-hmm.
Some people talk about that as pessimism of the intellect, optimism of the will. And that's one of the things that the Marxist tradition has to offer. Having lost a number of times, right? We're the people who like losing adds up to something is the idea. And I think that's true. I believe that. I'm a radical, and I want to share what I think are the benefits of that perspective with as many people as possible in a way that I hope is not alienating, right? That doesn't make them feel like this person has thinly veiled disgust for me, or is not willing to see things from my perspective, or like thinks I'm an idiot or whatever, because I don't think those things. And I think there is this space for coherence among people with different beliefs.
Last question for you. You reference a lot of different books and films and pieces of art in this book. And I'm wondering if there are any pieces of art or content that are giving you or bringing you clarity or comfort in this current moment.
Ooh, that's a really good question. Let me pull up the answer. It's a series that the streamer Mubi has been doing called Self-Portrait as a Coffee Pot by the South African artist William Kentridge. And it's a 9-part video series. Yeah, a 9-part visual series in the studio of this artist, William Kentridge. Was filmed during the most intense lockdown periods of COVID. Amazing. I mean, he's an amazing artist in general, but it's an amazing view of his mind, of his techniques, but also his perspective on history. And he does this great thing where he doubles himself, and he's constantly talking back and forth with himself. There are 2 of him. And they create this amazing dialectic between a lot of different positions right now, because there are a lot of contradictory truths, antinomies, I guess, that we have to hold in this historical moment. And one of the ways he does that is by splitting himself and arguing with himself. Fantastic, fantastic series. Ultimately, I think hopeful in the useful ways and despairing in the useful ways, that you can be hopeful and despairing at the same time. If you're dialectical enough, you can be hopeful and despairing at the same time. And that's definitely a piece that really lately captured it for me. It's fantastic. I beseech readers to go check that out.
Amazing. I feel like in this moment in particular, being hopeful and despairing in useful ways is a pretty worthy aspiration for all of us. I
think so. I think people are trying to figure that stuff out. It's hard. It's a hard environment in which to think. And I don't fault anyone who feels completely overwhelmed by even just the task of thinking critically in this moment. But we got to do it. I don't think there's no other choice.
Well, congratulations on the book, Malcolm, and thanks so much for this conversation.
Yeah, thanks so much for reading it. And this has been really great.
That is it for this week. Make sure you're subscribed so you don't miss our new season. You can access a transcript of this episode and read all sorts of other stories on our website at drill.media. You can also sign up for our Patreon there. Free members will get our weekly newsletter. And if you want to support our work by becoming a paid subscriber, you'll get access to bonuses like sneak peeks of upcoming episodes, additional interviews, and more. There's a link to subscribe on our homepage. Drilled is an original Critical Frequency production. This episode was reported and hosted by Adam Lowenstein and produced by Peter Duff. Our fact checker is Shilpa Jindia. Artwork by Matt Fleming. James Wheaton of the First Amendment Project is our First Amendment lawyer. The show was created by me, Amy Westervelt. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you next time.